There are a few things that we can do to optimize the running of the aggregation design wizard. First, we need to get rid of any attributes that are unnecessary in our dimension. For example, we may know that there are some attributes here that queries never use, so we can select them and just delete them from our dimension. Of course, having user hierarchies is always a good idea. A natural hierarchy is one where we have a one-to-many relationship coming from the top of the hierarchy down. For every category, we have multiple subcategories. For every subcategory, we have multiple products. That is a natural hierarchy. Now, if I were to create an unnatural hierarchy that's allowed, that would be something like this. But this is where I have many colors, have many sizes. And although this is allowed, it's not going to be useful for aggregation purposes, and it's not going to give us better query performance. When we create natural hierarchies, it's very important to make sure that we have the correct attribute relationships. Moving from left to right, we would have our many-to-one relationship. So that the user hierarchy, as we go from the top down, as the one-to-many. Here in the attribute relationships, you can think of the one-to-many as moving from the right to the left. Creating a user hierarchy does not necessarily create the correct attribute relationship, so it's very important that you come in here to check those. Now, if there's an attribute useful for reporting or for calculations, but it's not necessarily something that you want the analysis server to look at for aggregation purposes, you can change the attribute hierarchy enabled property to false. When you do this, you'll see that it grays out the attribute. Now, you may not want to disable this attribute on all cubes. So this is also something that you can set either here in the dimension, or you can go to the Cube Structure tab and you can set this property to false here. And whatever setting is set at the dimension level will be overridden within this cube only. Now, as we've discussed previously, there's the aggregation usage property, which you can look at for each attribute here and configure accordingly. And then all of this work ahead of time will ensure that analysis services can quickly perform the analysis it needs to do to create aggregation designs. When we launch the wizard, one more step that you want to consider above and beyond the aggregation usage is making sure that you get the object counts correct. Now, this particular cube has only one partition, and we'll talk about partitions in another module, but an important consideration here is to not only get a count of the objects overall, but especially to get a count of the objects within a particular partition. Now, if you only have one partition, you don't need to worry about this, but as you break down into separate partitions, it's very important that you identify the number of distinct members that will be associated with a particular partition. If the number that you provide here is too high, you may not get an aggregation that should be designed, and vice versa. If you give a number that's too low, you might get aggregations that wind up hurting performance rather than helping. You don't have to be exact here, just make sure that you're within the correct order of magnitude.